before, grief is natural. Grief is a response. And depression is not. Depression is something that's clinically significant. It's an illness even that can be treated. And so the reason why it's so confusing, though, is because they look so much the same. And so if you see underneath, they talk about grief, change in appetite, change in your sleep, fatigue, tearfulness, hard time concentrating, avoiding people, hopelessness, some anger. And then you look at depression, and a lot of it pretty much sounds similar, doesn't it? Like talking about a change in your mood, not being interested in your activities, changes in your appetite, changes in your sleep, difficulty concentrating, once again. But if you flip over to the other side, I really love this handout from a hospice in Fargo, North Dakota. If you flip over to the other side, it puts grief and depression side by side. And it kind of goes into a little bit more detail of why there's a difference there. Are there any thoughts or reactions to this? So, like I had said before, grief is something that happens for everybody, but depression is something that stands out. It's usually something that needs to be addressed, if not by therapy, then possibly medication. It's not something that you immediately are able to just work through on your own. Usually you need some additional support. And I would say there would be similar things there with grief as well, but grief doesn't need to be medicated, is essentially what I'm trying to say.
Would grief be considered like a catalyst for new depression?
It can, yes, because with depression, there's actually different types of grief that I was going to go into, and one of it is like relationships with mental illness or mental health. The points where grief becomes a problem or grief becomes concerning is if you're having thoughts of harming yourself, or if you're turning to substances like alcohol or other substances to self-medicate, and if you're thinking about harming others. Those are the big ones. And pretty much other than that, anything kind of goes in grief. And that's sometimes comforting to know that what you may be feeling isn't out there, but, or when I say out there, it isn't odd, but on the other hand, it's also not comforting to know that it's different for everybody, so you can't really predict how you're going to react. Does that answer your question? But yes, a loss can definitely be a trigger for depression. It's just that sometimes depression shows up in and of itself in other parts of your life without necessarily having a loss at the start of it. So, types of grief. There is no set number now on the different types of grief that I've heard definitions for, but not all grief is the same, and that's one of the most important things to know is that not all grief, I lost my cat back in 2016, and although that was a very important loss to me, I'm not going to compare it to somebody losing their child or their mother or something along those lines. It's a totally different experience. So, anticipatory grief. is actually the type of grief that we experience when maybe we're hearing that a loved one has a terminal illness or that they are getting close to their end of life. You're having to come to terms with the fact that this is going to be goodbye eventually, not necessarily tomorrow, but it's going to be goodbye at some point. And even though we all know that we're all born and we all die, it still seems to take us by surprise. You're never going to be really ready. But anticipatory grief is that way of maybe trying to process and go through that realization. Disenfranchised grief is when you've lost somebody and the general community may not view it as a legitimate grief. So when I say that, I might say, an example would be if you've lost an ex-spouse. So somebody that you weren't currently in a relationship, people might react in the way of saying, well, you divorced or you aren't with each other anymore, so you don't necessarily need to be sad about that. Or if there's stigma surrounding that death, like if it was a death by suicide or if it was a death from HIV/AIDS, sometimes people don't feel like they can talk about it, or they might say something along the lines of that was their decision. Complicated grief is when I was mentioning thoughts about harming yourself or harming others or wanting to turn to substances for it. Complicated grief being the term, of course the response is all grief is complicated. It's complicated in how you personally experience it. It's not going to the park and just sitting among flowers and enjoying yourself. Grief does involve some pretty hard work when you're going through a loss of somebody. So there are studies and people that are saying complicated grief is just when grief interacts with mental illness, when there's serious depression there that needs to be addressed. There's inhibited grief, and that's when people may have experienced a loss and they don't want to think about it. They're trying to protect themselves and close themselves off because they don't want to feel that pain or that discomfort. There's masked grief, which is different from inhibited grief, where they're experiencing grief, but apparently they just don't realize it. They just think that they're going through a tough time right now and they can't understand it. There's traumatic grief. So if there was a bad accident or something related to a person's death, because obviously there's a difference between somebody who may have passed away had a long sickness over a long period of time versus somebody who died in a car accident. That sudden loss and not really seeing it coming. There's abbreviated grief, so that's a grief that maybe you're really able to process and accept that loss and continue on with your life, even though you are sad that they're gone, you're still able to function pretty well. And then there's collective grief, which I was asking Joan right before everything started, and she had said that there have been members of this group that have died in the past. And so for you all, if you lost a support group member that you knew and that you're having a hard time or thinking about them, you're a collective group and then experiencing a collective grief. Cumulative loss or cumulative grief is having multiple losses over time. I actually just worked with a woman in hospice. Her mother died last month and her father died 10 months before that. And so it's just the one loss after another, and sometimes even more than just that. It's a lot of struggle. And then there's normal grief, which I don't particularly like that title because it implies that there is a particular way that grief is supposed to look, and it's not. But simply saying that normal grief is that something that you're able to engage in everyday life, and it's not necessarily keeping you from doing your day-to-day activities. So I'm going to talk about myths about grief, but I didn't know if anybody here had any opinions about what are some common things that you hear when you're grieving that aren't necessarily helpful if they're meant, even though they may be coming from a good place. Yes.
How do you handle people who, like, I'm not talking just about grief, but maybe depression and grief. How do you handle people who really don't have the foggiest notion of what you're going through?
How do you handle people who may come and they have a lot of ideas of what you're going through, but they don't really know?
Yeah, or they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. You know what? That's a really great question. And something, when Joan was first speaking and she said, until you guys tell me otherwise, I'm going to keep at this, or I'm not getting off my soapbox until you say no. The only way to get a straight answer or a straight idea from a person is by being straightforward with them. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to be coded in niceness if you're worried about hurting their feelings, but you can say, I appreciate that you're trying to be nice to me and trying to offer support, but that's not how I want your support. And then you can give them a constructive way that they can be there for you. So the platitudes of they're in a better place, they wouldn't want you to be sad, you know, it's at least they're not suffering anymore. You know, whether or not those things are true, they aren't necessarily helpful. Is that helpful at all to you?
Well, it seems like though, even you tell them, they still keep on doing that.
Yeah, and you know, I think some of that is a reaction of nervousness. People don't know exactly what to do when there's a loss. An example for me personally of when I definitely felt short of being a supportive person. I had a friend of mine who died in a car accident in high school, and I knew his family, and I had no idea what to say to them. And so instead of saying anything, I avoided them for over a year. And the only time that I ended up seeing them was, I went to James Madison University in my high school. They have their graduations at the Convocation Center at JMU. And I happened to be there on the day that my high school graduation was occurring, and they showed up in the parking lot because there was going to be a memorial graduation for him. And I had no idea what to say even then. So it sounds like, I don't know if they're face to face with you when these things happen, but if you're telling them you're not helping me, and if you're even offering examples of how to be helpful to you and they're not doing it, I would just have to say, I'm going to need to take a break from this conversation because I don't feel like you're listening to me. And hopefully they can take that to heart and actually do something that along the lines, listen to you and try to show you the support. But I get what you're saying, because people definitely, they get nervous, they don't know what to say, and they feel like they have to comfort you and they have to fix it. And that's the thing about grief, is that it isn't something that you can fix.